Welcome again for those that were already here. Good afternoon, and I'm extremely pleased to be here with you today, and welcome from our online participants that are watching this great State of Cities Climate Finance report launch. So today, this year actually marks a very important date for CCFLA, so for the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. We are actually celebrating 10 years that we 10 years that CCFLA was actually started here in New York during an SG Climate Action Summit. 5 years ago, we were renewed also in New York with support from the German government, having CBI as the secretariat. So we have a lot to celebrate this year. This morning, we held a members-only session, so some of you already celebrated a bit with us. And during that session, the goal was how can we increase collaboration among the members, discuss the key topics around urban climate finance, and what have we been achieving and accomplishing together. CCFLA, what we aim as the Secretariat, and for those I don't know, I actually didn't introduce myself. Very nice to meet you. My name is Priscilla, and I have been throughout this last 5 years together with a lot of our colleagues in the Secretariat leading CCFLA. And what we want to achieve as the Secretariat is being this space of excellency and this space where we actually can go to knowledge around urban climate finance. And the State of Cities Climate Finance report and the work that we are doing on urban climate finance is the key to that for us. And it's our flagship report. So we have actually published the first report in 2021. The goal then was to have this assessment around how much finance was actually flowing to cities globally, trying to have a picture of the sources, the financial instruments, the climate uses, the sectors, and having a more informed conversation around urban climate finance, where we are and where we want to go. And I think in the 2021 version, we worked very closely with the Atlantic Council, with the World Bank, and we were very happy what we have achieved, but we cannot stop there. So we definitely need to understand how we are evolving, where do we want to get. Personally, I have to say that I'm even more happy to be here because on the 2021 report, I actually had my son before being able to launch the report. So I wasn't at the launch and I was on maternity leave. So it adds on my happiness of being able to launch this report this year. And this report has additional information that we are very happy to share. So we have updated the numbers from 2021, trying to see this evolution, but we also did effort to understand the needs assessment, so to better try to understand where is the gap on urban climate finance. So we hope that you can use these numbers, that we can, together as a community that is working in this space, this helps and support your own work on calling attention from the role of cities into the climate finance space and how they are important to be able to work on the climate transition. So we hope that this report shows you everything, all of that, and then we continue to work together to understand better this framework and this landscape of urban climate finance. So I think we have been throughout this week that it seems like Friday, but it was still on Tuesday. But we have been promising the data, but we haven't been showing to anyone. So now it's online, by the way. So if you want to check it out, it's there. And we're very, very happy to show it to you just now. So I'm going to introduce one of our leading authors that worked very hard to make this happen. So Jessie will walk you through the data and present you the reports. So yes, Jessie works in our secretariat. She is a senior analyst, and come Jessie. Jessie, please. Thank you.
Okay, and she needs no introduction. Great, thanks everybody. Really excited to be here today. I'm Jessie, a senior analyst for the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. Thank you to Priscilla for getting the energy up in the afternoon for the event you've all been waiting for in New York Climate Week, the launch of the State of Cities report. So we can go to the next slide, sorry. The State of Cities Climate Finance Report in 2024 provides the most comprehensive available assessment of urban climate finance flows and needs. In this report, we cover urban climate finance between 2019 to 2022, focusing on the averages across 2021 and 2022 as the most recently available data. The report has all of this in great detail, and I will give you a lightning presentation today in the next 15 minutes. We build, as Priscilla mentioned, on the previous 2021 report, ensuring data comparability to facilitate an understanding of evolving trends in urban climate finance over time. We track urban climate finance by combining project-level investments from an extensive database compiled by CPI, CDP, and others, and then capital expenditure estimates across key urban sectors. Climate finance tracking faces limitations, as many people in the room know, and we present, therefore, a conservative estimate of urban climate investments. The current report also presents for the first time a granular estimate of urban mitigation needs by compiling underlying existing scenarios to estimate the amount of mitigation finance that cities need by 2030 and 2050. Oh, sorry, I'm still on the previous slide. Sorry. I'll get there in a minute. We're happy to say that from now you can view and download the report on our website. For this edition, we wanted the data also to be assessed and used. So you'll see on there that we've published our data as well online, which can be broken down by region, provider, and more. So without further ado, I'll showcase the main results of our flows and needs assessment. But our main goal is really to look forward and understand how to close the city's finance gap. So I'll end with a summary of our recommendations and our new agenda, and then we will discuss that with a fantastic panel after me. So a little bit of motivation. As we've said many times today, and hopefully you're hearing throughout the week, cities are really indispensable for the climate transition. Over half of the world's population currently live in cities, and this is only set to increase to 7 in 10 people by 2050. Cities are already on the front lines of responding to climate change, facing floods, extreme heat, and intense weather events. As examples that probably most of you had either heard about or lived through, we've seen flooding earlier this year in the south of Brazil, urban heat effects increasing across the globe. Delhi saw temperatures over 52 degrees Celsius earlier this year, and these kind of disasters will only be more frequent and have a tremendous impact on city residents. We therefore need to consider how cities will grow and how climate change will impact city residents, the urban poor, and urban infrastructure all together, and cities need more investment to meet their climate goals. Next slide. These challenges are also a huge opportunity to invest in the future by investing in sustainable and resilient urban infrastructure. Cities need more climate finance, and I promise I'll get to the numbers soon, but they also must be empowered to take action, the action needed to safeguard their futures against climate change. Scaling urban climate finance successfully, therefore, requires acknowledging several systemic challenges that prevent cities from achieving their climate goals. We focus on 4 in the report. First, insufficient global and national commitment to urban climate action. Second, weak enabling environments for city-level climate policy and finance. Third, capacity gaps among cities and local governments. And finally, inadequate capital mobilization at the city level. The report goes into much more detail on how these challenges present and how they hinder urban climate finance from reaching the cities that it most needs to reach. Understanding and overcoming these challenges are a key part of the strategy to mobilize city climate finance at scale by 2030. Next slide, please. So where are we now with urban climate finance flows? Next slide. Great. I will now walk through some of the highlights from the 2019 to 2022 finance analysis, and again, encourage you to refer to the report for more detailed information. First, next slide, please. We need to first define what is urban climate finance, and this is a huge part of the methodology that CCFLA has developed for our tracking and needs assessment. We follow CCFLA's definition of urban climate finance, which refers to financial resources directed at activities aimed at limiting city-induced greenhouse gas emissions and to activities intended to address climate-related risks faced by cities. Using this definition, the report provides an updated, comprehensive climate finance taxonomy for urban mitigation and adaptation, which is available as an appendix on the main report. So finally, the results. And it wouldn't be a CCFLA presentation without starting with the Sankey. The headline number, urban climate finance reached $831 billion in 2021 and 2022. And this diagram shows granularity in the breakdown of that total. Very quickly on how to read a Sankey diagram, the columns of the Sankey show the distribution of urban climate finance flows from sources and intermediaries on the left through to the destinations of climate finance on the right. The first column, providers, shows the breakdown by source of finance. So public finance is in blue. For those of you in the back, private finance is in orange, and the unknown sources are in purple. Here we can already see that the majority, almost 49% of climate finance was provided by private providers, and public finance accounted for 22%. The second column shows the instruments which were used to disperse urban climate finance. Equity financing was the most used instrument, accounting for $312 billion, or 38% of the total. The third and fourth columns show the regional destinations of urban climate finance and the split by climate use between mitigation, adaptation, and dual uses, and then sector investments on the right, but I'll go into those in more detail in the next few slides. Next slide, please. Tracked urban climate finance has more than doubled from 2017 or 2018, the last iteration of this report, again reaching $831 billion. A small amount of this comes from the increase in methodological improvements, and most of this comes from increases in climate finance on a comparable basis with the previous report. The main increase comes from private finance, which has more than tripled, and public finance, which has more than doubled since 2017 or 2018. Next slide, please. Private and public actors, again, accounted for 49% and 22% of total urban climate finance, respectively. We see a very significant role of private finance actors in providing urban climate finance, particularly households and individuals. So public finance is shown in blue on the top, and private is in the orange waffle chart on the bottom. The largest single source of public finance was national governments, providing 36% of the total. These flows, however, have largely stagnated since the previous report, rising by only 10% from 2017 or 2018. The largest increase in public finance came from development finance institutions, which more than doubled their contribution from 2017 and 2018. Public finance overall, however, remains severely unevenly distributed. Half went to China alone, while remaining emerging markets and developing economies received 7%, and least developed countries less than 2%. Private actors almost tripled their urban climate finance contribution, reaching $404 billion in 2021-2022. And almost half of tracked private finance came from households and individuals, largely as purchases of electric vehicles. Next slide, please. As we saw in the Sankey, most urban climate finance goes towards mitigation. So this is mitigation finance broken down by sector. Mitigation finance more than doubled in 2021 and 2022, and transport represented 52% of total investments. Private entities were the main providers of urban mitigation finance, while public actors financed $173 billion. Next slide, please. Tracked adaptation finance remains low at just under $10 billion total. This Sankey presents the flows of adaptation finance that we are able to track in this report. One of our main findings here is that water and wastewater activities received the majority, 68% of the tracked urban adaptation finance. Data limitations, as well as limited definitions of adaptation finance, limit us in tracking more adaptation projects and in tagging the adaptation component of some investments. Great. In terms of the regional breakdown, urban climate finance mostly went to cities in developed economies, $339 billion total, and China at $336 billion total. Cities in emerging markets and developing economies received only 11% of the total, and least developed countries just 1%. Urbanization will increase rapidly in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, so there is a need to increase investment on climate resilient infrastructure in these regions in the future. Next slide, please. Great. One important finding of this report that will tie to our conclusions and that we heard mentioned earlier in some of the sessions is that it was the importance of domestic markets in financing urban climate action. The majority of city climate finance was sourced domestically in all regions except for sub-Saharan Africa. We refer to domestic climate finance as funds that were raised and spent within the same country. So public domestic climate finance was mostly concentrated in East Asia and the Pacific, led by China, followed by Western Europe. Cities in these regions will therefore likely continue to achieve their climate goals based on the availability of domestic financing. And cities in underserved regions, such as emerging markets and developing economies, will need a stronger enabling environment and better access to strong domestic climate finance markets to achieve their, to achieve their climate goals. All right, next slide, please. So we also, for the first time, conducted a needs assessment of what cities need to achieve climate targets by 2030 and 2050. We completed this by combining underlying predictive scenarios about climate finance needs required to achieve 1.5 degrees climate targets. Our assessment is limited by data gaps in the underlying scenarios, and in particular, we are missing detailed data for urban adaptation needs. We present here a range of estimates due to uncertainty in climate trajectories. Our main finding, our headline finding, is cities need $4.3 trillion per year for mitigation alone by 2030, and again for mitigation over $6 trillion by 2050, $6 trillion US dollars by 2050. We show here the gap to contextualize that despite progress in urban climate flows, especially for mitigation, a large gap still remains to help cities achieve 1.5. Estimates are based on current climate scenarios, but if the gap persists and urban climate finance still falls short, these costs may continue to increase over time with increasing emissions from urban areas. I'll break down quickly needs by sector. We're able to break down urban mitigation needs by sector and find that transport, buildings, and energy cumulatively require 89% of total urban mitigation investments until 2030. Transport during this period will account for 40% of the investment needs, almost $1.7 trillion annually for cities. Most of these climate-aligned transport investments that are needed are driven by requirements for electric vehicles and urban rail systems. Adaptation needs are more difficult to project due to a general lack of data, particularly from the private sector. In the report, we currently only cover the needs of cities in emerging markets and developing economies, which total $147 billion per year by 2030 and $165 billion until 2050. However, we know these estimates are likely large underestimations. Cities, as we all know, are already facing increasingly high costs of inaction. Some cities are already experiencing billions of dollars in losses due to water shortages, flooding, and infrastructure damage. I'll talk through some examples quickly to underscore this point. In the US, Los Angeles spends approximately $2 to $3 billion per decade on purchasing wholesale water due to climate-related shortages, averaging $250 million annually. In India, Mumbai spent $115 million on stormwater drainage and water retention infrastructure redevelopment following Cyclone Nisarga in 2022. And also in 2022, a storm bringing days of heavy precipitation in the Durban area of South Africa resulted in floods and landslides and estimated insured losses of over $1.5 billion US dollars. This underscores the importance of increasing data availability on the cost of inaction, insured losses, and adaptation needs for cities. So based on all this data, the question we really want to answer in this report and through CCFLA actions and member activities is how to close the city's climate investment gap. We present here 4 key recommendations based on the key findings from the data. First, we must improve the quantity and quality of urban climate finance. This is clear from the scale of the gap between flows and mitigation needs and the rising cost of adaptation for cities. Beyond scaling quantity, enhancing the quality of finance or how finance is distributed among sectors, addresses underlying inequalities, and strengthens enabling environments is also key. Second, as we saw, the vast majority of urban climate finance is sourced domestically, so we must strengthen domestic markets through the strategic use of public finance. We saw that the majority of urban climate, This trend is only likely to grow, and the urban climate finance ecosystem will therefore need to bolster domestic markets so that cities and local governments can better access both public and private finance sourced within their own country. Third, we must rapidly scale urban adaptation finance, particularly in emerging markets and developing economies. We must channel investments into adaptation efforts in developing economies and also expand our taxonomy as practitioners of risks to effectively address and respond to climate disasters. And fourth and finally, we must improve data and tracking of urban climate finance flows and needs. Tracking urban climate finance, the work that CCFLA has been doing through the State of Cities Climate Finance Reports, generates crucial data to support policy and investment decisions by both national and subnational policymakers, as well as impact-oriented investors. This data is essential for identifying progress, gaps, and opportunities in the green transition of cities. Beyond these recommendations, we'd like to propose the 4C agenda to close the urban climate finance gap so that everybody remembers, leaving this room, the 4 key principles and not a laundry list of recommendations, as well as an underlying framework that can help guide action to achieve our recommendations and close the city's climate finance gap. So the 4 Cs. The first C is for commitment to raising urban issues on the global and national climate finance agenda. The second C is for collaboration between actors to improve climate finance flows for cities. The third C is for capacity building for public and private actors to respond to climate change in cities and achieve urban climate finance goals. And the final C is for capital, increased capital mobilization at the city level. Great. And that's it. So thank you. I encourage you to visit the website and read the report for more insights. And please feel free to ask any questions. I'll turn it over to Priscilla to discuss the results with our panel.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much, Jessie. And thank you so much for the team that put it together. So we have a team of authors that hopefully they are watching us from the UK, from Brazil, from India. And it was a whole year effort to put this numbers out. And also thank you so much for our funders, so BMZ, BMWK, they have allowed us and help us to make this follow up and this numbers happen in the end. So now let's discuss it, which is even more exciting, right? So I wanted to call here and please come in. So Angelica Nunes, who is a practical manager in the World Bank. Thank you. You can join us. Jorge Gastolumi, who is the Senior Director at the Atlantic Council on Resilient Cities. Katie Walsh, who is the Head of Climate Finance for Cities, States, and Region in North America, lead for CDP. And last but definitely not least, our Mayor Nicola Armcost, who is the Mayor of Hastings-on-Hudson here in New York. So thank you so much for joining us. Let's applaud them also. And I'm gonna stay here because I don't fit there, but let's try not to be that formal on this approach. So I think what we want is to discuss the results, understand it, try to bring it a bit of flavor and context. And we're very happy, and thank you so much for accepting to have our invitation. And I'm gonna start with trying to dig a little bit from the data and the information we brought in. And I'm going to start with you, Mayor Nicola. And I think in the beginning of the report, we also tried to bring up challenges that the cities are facing to scale this urban climate finance that we are talking about. And we know that one of the issues is about the negative capital mobilization. So we understand from your perspective, and you can tell us a little bit more about your town too, how difficult it is to access this finance from international and private capital markets, and what the solutions have you envisioned or been able to achieve for now? Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It really is a pleasure to be here. And the very short answer to your question is very difficult. When people ask me what keeps me up at night as a mayor, my answer is inevitably financing infrastructure, particularly infrastructure that relates to climate resiliency. And I think that's the kind of conversation that I end up having with mayors from all over the world. We all say the same thing. We chit chat about various things, and inevitably we end up coming back to, you know, what are your climate vulnerabilities? For us here in the northeast of the US, it is extreme weather and flooding. And, you know, inevitably we end up talking about storm sewers. I think mayors are the only group of people who happily talk about storm sewers over dinner with one another. And we talk about the horrific state of our storm sewers. It doesn't matter where we are, but they all require billions and billions of dollars of investment if you add it all together. So I wanted to pick up a point that David made earlier, where he said, mayors don't talk about the different financing mechanisms. They don't describe that. They'll just take whatever money they can get from wherever they can get it. And we heard earlier about, you know, very elegant sounding solutions like blended finance. That sounds so elegant and delicious. I can tell you, for us, it's lumpy finance. It's putting together different bits of finance from where we can get it. So at the moment, there is a lot of financing that's available in terms of grant funding in the US. The Biden administration has put a huge amount of money into the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that is actually coming to municipalities. It's sort of a miracle. There's also money from private foundations. At the state level in New York, there's a real commitment to climate financing. And so there are ways you can put together that type of grant financing. In addition, we look to the local bond market. All of us end up bonding for various things. We try and pull together financing mechanisms like user fees, renting out our roofs to solar developers, and bringing in an income that way. And so we end up finding all sorts of different ways to kind of patch together financing that will help us move the dial. For me in Hastings, it's been a focus on geothermal for municipal buildings. It's been on the transition to electric vehicles. Sometimes a little bit of a tussle with our police, persuading them that they really should be driving electric vehicles, given how much they idle. You know, sometimes these conversations are a little bit tricky, but we're trying to make that move. And that's the way in which we've been financing those types of projects. The thing that's really difficult to finance, though, for most of us until very recently, is improvements in stormwater infrastructure. So culverts, drains, daylighting streams, getting rid of dams, investing in green infrastructure. That is much harder to piece together. So what I would say is that accessing grant funding is extremely difficult. Eligibility criteria can be unclear or require complicated prerequisites. Grant cycles can be erratic. Funding is often focused on studies rather than implementation. I made a slightly snide comment to myself where I said, which benefits consultants rather than constituents. Matching funding requirements can be too onerous, resulting in partial funding. Reporting requirements can be overly complex. Disbursements can take too long. Eligible municipalities sometimes don't have the capacity to draft proposals or manage funds once they've received them. And then I think the sort of obvious political point is that municipal leadership can change. So today's climate champion can be gone. The project no longer has a champion, it languishes, and maybe it never gets completed. So really, when I compare notes with other mayors, I don't think there's an official term, lumpy finance, but I think that's what we all agree on as the way in which we put things together. So I hope that answers the question.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think it gives us a lot of food for thought. I could connect with a lot of the things you said, but I'll connect with what you mentioned about the need to stormwater infrastructure, because one of the key aspects that we got in the report, and it's a continuation, right? Like it's something that we also conclude on our first report, is like the lack of adaptation financing and how most of the finance that we are able actually to track, because there's also finance that we are not able to track and show on the data, but it's around water and wastewater sector. So like 68% of all the data that we managed to track on adaptation finance. And I'm going to repeat a bit of the data so you learn it by heart at the end of the session. So Jorge, I want to come to you. One, because you have been working with us very closely in CCFLA, also to improve that data assessment, particularly on the first report of the state of city. So, and based on your experience, like what are the key factors driving the investment on adaptation? How can we get lessons learned so we can raise adaptation and infrastructure finance, particularly on adaptation investments in other sectors, also beyond water? So I would love to hear from you.
Sure. And thank you for the invitation for today, and also for the invitation to be part of a steering committee of the paper. It's been a fun exercise. Jesse, thank you so much for steering us. I would say that goes back to several of the points that Jesse made in her presentation, that are the lack of data. I don't want to minimize the reality of what you have been able to encounter, that it's the majority of the money for adaptation is going to the to the water and wastewater sectors. It might be the case overall, but I think because of lack of data, the numbers are underrepresented. Maybe not that proportion, maybe still say around 70% for that sector, but the numbers are underrepresented in terms of how much money is going into adaptation. That was a comment that I made on one of our last calls of the steering committee, and I think that's a relevant piece for adaptation that we're going to have to learn from. And so I just wanted to look into the water and wastewater sectors, and what makes the water and wastewater sectors more easy to measure. I would like to focus more on that for now. And one of the things that this sector has proven is that there has been a lot of development focus over years on this particular sector, both for adaptation and mitigation, particularly in the wastewater sector. And so there has been a lot of data that's been produced, a lot of effort and focus from cities and hence also from the private sector on how they can advance. And so that has created data that could give us a bit of sense of what could work for other sectors if we start building that track record in terms of investments. And so first of all, if we can measure the investments that are going to other sectors, then we'll first of all we'll know what is the impact that it's creating, and hence we can measure that impact, and hence we can understand also how to scale up those investments. That's one piece that this sector particularly gives us. The other is the gaps. We can also identify the gaps that this sector is bringing to the table in terms of how much money is not, what else is needed as you try to do it, but also how can we understand what are the solutions that need to be developed to cover those gaps. And then the last point is, I think, just going beyond that particular sector, is how we can, given that adaptation is granted adaptation is local and the solutions will be local to several cases, I think we're lacking the opportunity to have taxonomies and ways in which we can define investments in a way in which they could be tracked in a more standardized way. And by lacking that, then it's really hard to understand whether investments are going into adaptation or not. Of those investments could be considered an adaptation. One last point that I wanted to make before going to closing some other pieces is that in the case of water and wastewater, there has been the opportunity to identify ways to bring the private sector into the equation, being that via water utilities, being that like wastewater, particularly how you can use markets such as carbon markets. So there's many ways in which you can monetize some of the returns that you're bringing for that sector and the investments that they're doing, and how you can pay back for investments that are blended between private and public. And lumpy as well could be, but that's another lesson that the water sector and the wastewater sector have been able to bring to a table. They have figured out a way to monetize. It might not happen for other kind of sectors, but it's something that is important to consider. And finally, for the water and wastewater sectors, it has had a systemic approach. So things have been looked throughout the cycle of producing water, managing water, deploying water, and that also implies, the energy consumption of it, the elements of health and how it's connected to other services that water could produce, including food security as well. So if you look at the whole system, then you start identifying what are the kind of investments that you need to do, and that gives you a better sense of how you are tracking those investments and then pulling out these numbers that are coming out of this report as adaptation investments. I'll just make one more comment that I made during our conversations, that adaptation is, in some cases, require investments that are not purely infrastructure. All the investments that you need to do on early warning systems, the investments that you might want to do in terms of, buying insurance for catastrophes and disasters that could happen, and the premiums are being paid towards that, and the services the financial services you need to cover for that. So there are elements there of adaptation that we might be missing in the tracking, because they are not hard infrastructure you can actually see and take a picture of, but that require investment as well. And some of those investments will not be inflating the numbers, that making the numbers too much more higher. But those are things that we need to track as well. Not only the hard infrastructure, but also those other kind of services that will require us to get to adaptation mandate. Thank you.
No, I think you raise very interesting points on the connection of course, like we have a gap on the tracking of adaptation, how this is connected to a lack of a taxonomy that is overall adapted by different players, because we have taxonomies, but they are not necessarily understood and adopted by players on the development, and how this actually has an effect on how you don't have that many private sector investments looking into that more. So like the connection between the need for information. And I think what we want with this report is also this: how do you improve information, improve data? So we also put this topic out for different players that are not necessarily there. So it's very, very good points. Thank you so much, Jorge. And then I wanted to bring the discussion of a very important player in the space on the urban climate finance generally, and the urban one, which are multilateral development banks. I know, Angelica, that you cannot answer for them all, but what we see with the data in this report is that we had from when we started, and we were very happy to work with the World Bank on our first edition with Sandrine and many, that was the provision of finance rose from 2017 to 18. So we want to understand, from your perspective, what is the challenges from MDBs to increase and work in the urban climate finance space and to further accelerate urban climate finance?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's truly a pleasure. First of all, congratulations on the report. It's really enormous what you've done and put together, and it's definitely a reference, and congratulations on the 10 years as well. I'll speak here for the World Bank, which is the only thing I can really relate, but I think we share a lot of the common challenges and concerns. No? I think the World Bank, for example, in particular, cities are already a priority for us when we defined our climate change plan, the World Bank climate change. They recognize urban systems as critical, right? That to say that even when we agree that it's important, even then it's an incredibly complicated thing to do. No, we agree that this should be a priority, and it's super challenging. The numbers, I'm impressed of what you've done. Even when we try to do it internally, obviously there's a lot of controversy. It's never straightforward. From the data that you saw, what we contribute to the overall multilaterals for the latest report is around $18 billion worth of climate finance. And we're very happy, as you mentioned, Priscilla, to report that it's an increase from the previous reporting, like everybody else, it seems to have increased, right? And 47 of that goes to adaptation, or what we define as adaptation. It's not nearly enough what's needed or what we would like to see, but at least we are moving in the right direction. And speaking a little bit on the challenges, which is I think what you asked from us, I think the first one is that although we say that cities are important, when we look into the intragovernmental systems and the roles and responsibilities and funding to the cities, we don't really put our money where our mouth is, right? So if we really say that cities are important and the country has a pledge to do all this on climate, then ideally you would see a commensurate sort of system to give the money to the city. From the multilateral side, we cannot come and do that for the country, right? That needs to be there. That architecture needs to be there. That system of intragovernmental financial flows and architecture really has to be there for us to be able to scale it up, to use it, to add to it, right? It's super important. And when it doesn't exist, then it's for us, it's a challenge on how do we make it happen. The second is, even when that exists, in many cases, there is not really a strong enabling environment in the sectors, right? And think about, for example, relatively, this is perhaps not even adaptation specific, but land markets, right? If land markets do not work, then you have a lot of people settling in places where they shouldn't be settling. And then you are just increasing the problem, increasing the cost of, eventually that will just add up to the needs of adaptation there. And it's just because the problem, or is originally a different problem, is a fundamental enabling environment to make investments in storm water or sanitation or anything else viable. No? So it's just this enabling environment that allows us to be able to invest sustainably. We have the duty to care about the sustainability of our investments, right? So we have to look at the enabling environment, and this is true for every multilateral that brings money to the table. Property rights, cost recovery in service provision when it's possible, or to the extent that it's possible. It's not always possible, but to the extent that it's possible. Adequate budgets for operation and maintenance, things like that, that allow investments to be sustainable. And when they don't exist, it's challenging for multilaterals to come in and support it. And the third, I think it's something that is already, I think, mentioned before by the mayor, is about the capacity to absorb and to implement, right? The capacity, because even if we have a big check, we don't always have a big check, but let's assume we have a check. If the capacity at local level to design projects, to bring projects to the table, to implement those projects in a way that is, if not speedy, at least in the good flow. That's another impediment for us, another challenge for us to be able to increase the flows. No? So I would stop there, but I think for us, those are the three main challenges that I would say that hinder our ability to further increase those numbers.
And the goal is how we work together, right? I think CCFLA, for those that know the alliance well, it's like, how can we help, and with the many organizations that are part of the alliance, the 84 now officially, to improve like the demand, the country level demand, the enabling environment, the capacity, which is very important. Katie, I want to ask you, and I think CDP has a key role around data and actually helping cities to understand better their data. This year within the State of Cities Climate Finance Report, we started to do this exercise about a needs assessment, which is also very difficult to do, right? Like, because we need to understanding this needs and understanding the gap. So I wanted to hear from you, for your experience, how this assessment, the needs assessment, can help to accelerate urban climate finance in the cities.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and also congratulations on the 10 years and all the work. I can think of many meetings that I've participated in the past, and seeing a lot of friends here from those opportunities. So at CDP, we are a global environmental disclosure platform. We work with thousands of companies and hundreds of local governments from cities and states on tracking and measuring their impact on the environment. And my presence with the mayor on showing up next to her was, I owe you our response for disclosure. And I know that that is something that, thank you, Public Forum, hold you accountable. But we work with local governments all over the world expressly for the purposes of making sure that they are telling their story on climate and the environment and their action, and also their gaps in projects and financing and places where they need assistance, if that's capacity building or technical assistance. So every year CDP sends out a disclosure request. Local governments are currently in the process of doing this. And through that, we have questions specifically on projects seeking financing. We work in partnership with many of the organizations that are here today. So the CDP ICLEI track, we work with GCOM, we work with C40, World Wildlife Fund. This is regional partners, global partners, to track and report these actions. So we established projects seeking financing. We started a process a couple of years ago. We're really digging down on a set of questions on what cities are looking to fund. And what we've seen through that process is actually, since we've been really, keeping track, is an increase from 2021, about a 60% increase of the projects that are being reported by local governments that are seeking financing. This aligns, if we look at the sort of top-down approach of the CCFLA report, right, and you're thinking of the CDP ICLEI track disclosure as the bottom-up, it aligns with those sectors. So across the board, globally, buildings, energy efficiency, and transportation being these, top sectors that are seeking financing, and then in the global south, water and waste projects, and in particular. I want to note of these, 2,500 projects that were reported seeking $70 billion in investment. We put this out at the end of last year in a partnership with the Global Covenant of Mayors, our global snapshot. We're going to be doing this again in 2024. It'll come out towards the end of this year, this global snapshot of projects seeking financing. And the process of doing this needs assessment, it relies on the self-reported disclosure of these local governments. And so just to kind of pick up where the last comments came down to is capacity building. So I think what I would want to, stress is the need at a local government level. None of these projects are in isolation. And I think really understanding and recognizing that, and that's definitely the CDP framework of really being able to think of the project seeking financing in the larger context of, if you are developing a climate action plan, if you've done a risk assessment, understanding sort of the project within the larger context. And when we have done showcasing and highlighting projects in different types of investor formats and roundtables, that is always what we hear is, do they have the capacity to implement this? And the disclosure serves as a mechanism to do that. So I think where I would want to offer sort of what are the next steps from this needs assessment that you put together, which I think is really exciting to have in the report this year, is just the need, sort of the call to action is that feedback loop, so that we have local governments being able to see that they're being rewarded for their climate action plans, and they're doing their risk assessment and developing the projects, and then being able to, again, have this feedback loop back so that they continue to share, do their storytelling. I'll leave it there for now.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think it connects very well with like our what we want to discuss now is like, okay, the set of recommendations that we put it out. And I think the first one goes into that the obvious one, right? We need more finance. So we need to actually raise the quantity, but also the quality of financing. And I think like what you mentioned around CDP, and we see that the demand is growing, which means also that the cities are more interested in like looking for investment in that front. It means that we have to improve not only the quantity, but the quality of the current finance. And by quality, what do we mean, right? Like the addressing inequality, strengthening the enabling environment. So, Angelica, I'm going to go back to you because you also raised that point. So like what, as a challenge, but how multilateral development banks such as the World Bank can play a role in improving this quality of finance and help to address the inequality, the strengthening the enabling environment, and mobilizing, for example, private finance.
Sure. I think our first responsibility as a multilateral would be to support through the quality of finance through data, right? And evidence that shows what works and what doesn't work and what can work. We also spend a significant amount of time, even believe it or not, convincing a lot of people that money should flow to cities. It's not yet, I think, unfortunately, universally understood. But to those, maybe some of you are familiar. The World Bank has a core report called the Country Climate Development Report, our CCDRs. We produce we produce them for country on a country level, right? And that report explores the relationship between growth in that country and climate, and to what extent they're correlated and they should be taken as a pair and not separate. And what the bank has done around 50 of these reports, and what they show clearly is that there are three things that really help, which is rapid development, resilient development, and targeted adaptation. And I mentioned those three because I think we're right now very focused on the latter, the last one, the targeted adaptation, which is the specific sort of delta and adaptation. But development and resilient development is another way of, let's say, achieving the same goal without the need then to come and retrofit and build additional or fix things, right? We know that people living in poverty in the countries where the World Bank has a mandate to work are the most vulnerable. And for them, development, the rapid development is probably the best way to support rather than find a much smarter way to find a guarantee for adaptation. I think development is a clear pathway for us that we see to improve the conditions. So it's not just about more adaptation finance, it's about more resilient development and the way we're building the day-to-day decisions that city make, their operational budgets, their current expenditures, being much more smart and climate smart about the way they spend their money. The second way we can support it, the quality of the finance, is through technical assistance. And the World Bank and many other multilaterals have capacity building programs. We have a suite of capacity building programs to help our clients build the climate action plans, work on specific project preparations, work on their creditworthiness, improve their creditworthiness so that they can go out and fund themselves, improve their own source revenues, which is a critical way to really have more money for the basic provision or even for adaptation or whatever they need. So happy to, share more about our specific programs. Just to mention the GAP Fund, which you probably know, I think it was mentioned before. It's one of our flagship programs, and the Creditworthiness Academy. And I think the last one is, and we don't do it enough, and I think it's because it's super complicated, and I think we need to find a wholesaling to do this, is the de-risking of projects, right? To find a way to wholesale either a typology of project or within a geographical region, to wholesale projects that we can help to de-risk and bring or try to make them much more attractive for private sector investors. I'll stop there.
No, great. Thank you so much. So more resilient development, TA, and de-risking. And I think you mentioned on your previous intervention about the role of the national government too, right? Like, our second recommendation is about domestic market. So a lot of our data shows that, as Jesse presented, that domestic markets are key. Like most of the investment are coming from the countries itself. And I think, Mayor, you also mentioned that specifically in the US, how was this important? So I want to, if you could comment this recommendation, and as a secondary city in the US with developed economy, but how important is this domestic market and the enabling conditions in supporting this climate ambitions and enabling us for climate finance?
Thank you. I'm just having listened to everyone, I'm gonna back into your question, starting with priorities and ambitions. And for us, our high level priorities are set out in what we call a comprehensive plan. It's like a vision plan for the municipality. And then our climate priorities and targets are set out in our climate action plan, our climate adaptation plan, our climate vulnerability assessment, our hazard mitigation plan, and most recently for us, a flood study, which, by the way, I probably shouldn't admit this to all of you, we discovered that our flood map of the municipality dated from 1935. So that clearly has to be updated. So it really starts with this idea of, what are your priorities and ambitions, and then what these plans do is they detail a set of projects, some of which are finance and shovel ready. And so I want to give a shout out to CDP, because if any of you, probably none of you have had to do this, but if you've actually reported to CDP, it is an amazing platform for setting out your priorities, your plans, your aspirations, your financing needs, et cetera, et cetera. So it gets you finance ready. And as you answer the question, if it's like, oh my God, I don't have an answer to question 3, clearly you're not ready for investment. So it's a really helpful tool. And also, you have an amazing team of darling people who are incredibly gracious. And as you're having a panic attack on the other end of the phone, they kind of talk you down. So that pipeline exists. And then for us, we have all of those projects in our multi-year finance plan. So it kind of has to be transferred into the finance plan. And then we've also created a set of policies which make our climate ambitions clear. So we have a green building code, we have a green fleet policy, we have a green procurement policy, we have unified solar permitting, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't come into my municipality and be unclear about our commitment to climate. It's there in all of the planning documents, it's in our policies, et cetera. So in parallel to developing these sort of policies, enabling environment policies, if you like, we've also been growing our fund balance, which, among other things, we use for grant matches if it's necessary. We've also worked to diversify our sources of funding. I talked about that a little bit earlier, user fees, et cetera. And so having these plans and strategies in place is really key for the practical business of accessing finance. And it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of resources, a lot of coordination. And basically, we all need support to put these things in place. So I want to give a shout out to CDP for kind of helping us get everything organized from a document point of view. I want to give a shout out to ICLEI and to all the other organizations that provide that technical assistance that helps. Some of it's very specialized with ICLEI. For us, for example, it was the greenhouse gas inventory, it was the climate action plan, it was the climate vulnerability assessment. Other entities provide other help, but you sort of have to patch it together, and you really need it in place if you want to access finance, because you have to show to an investor whether it's, private sector or whether it's the debt markets, that you're, as you put it, you're not a risk. You're de-risked, you're reasonable, you're a sensible place to invest. So anyway, that kind of support I think is hugely important. And then I want to sort of add another point, which is specifically on finance. We worked really hard to improve our creditworthiness. So here in the US, after the financial crisis, our rating went down. I was very upset. I mean, I think it happened to lots of municipalities, but you have to work really hard. I don't know if any of you are from rating agencies. They are super hardcore people. They are, you can't smile and be charming. You have to actually show. Yeah, there we go. Okay, it doesn't want to hear about the rating agencies. So, you have to show real data. And we were able to persuade Moody's, which is our rating agency, to raise us from AA3 to AA2. The last time we went out to the market, we ended up getting an incredibly low interest rate. I mean, it was kind of shockingly low. We all fell off our chairs. But it was amazing. It was in 2021 when the markets were really, really great. And so that source of funding is fantastic for these kinds of projects. And the thing I wanted to mention, actually, this was actually a really interesting point. We were able to persuade Moody's to include environmental factors in its actual written assessment of us. So, this is a big chit-chatty point. Actually, when you scratch the surface and you take the raters out for tea, they'll tell you that it's basically based on wealth and cash flow. But we managed to get in the fact that we were the highest ranked climate smart community in New York State, and we were at that time, one other municipality has edged us out, we're the highest ranked clean energy community in New York State. So that was really important to me to have that actually in the Moody's rating. So anyway, domestic markets have been a key source of funding, and that is the point about domestic markets is that it's inexpensive money. It's, at our rate was, I think, 1.1%. Like, that's very inexpensive money. So as a fiduciary of public funds, you really want to be getting access to finance at the best rates for your constituents. So again, I hope I answered the question.
Yes, no, definitely. I think you're raising so much important points around domestic markets, and we see that like in developed economies, we are also talking about the needs and support from TA and institutions and city networks and the role of creditworthiness. We can even think about what is going on in developing economies where we need still to create the domestic markets, right? Like, and improve them. So this is key. And I think the points that you raise are very important. Our third recommendation, and we're going to continue, is about adaptation for sure. Like, I think we have shown beautiful slides around how the cost of inaction is quite important. We lack the tracking, but we know that we still lack adaptation finance. And Jorge, I'm going to go back to you, as the Atlantic Council does so much work on this space. So what do cities need to attract more adaptation finance? And what is the support that we need for that? So, like, easy question.
Excellent. So I'm going to step just for a second out of cities per se, because there might be some answers are germane or specific to cities, but the formula is, well, first of all, there's no silver bullet to this. But I wanted to put a question for all of us. That is, if resilience investments have such large returns, which is what, it's assumed, because you're going to create a lot of public good and you're going to create ways in which you can avoid losses and ways in which you can create economic benefits and ways in which you can create social and environmental benefits. Some of those could be monetized and captured and value captured by the private sector. The majority of those are going to be captured publicly. If that's the case, why don't people do more of them? And so the answers that could apply to cities are: is it the nature of the investments per se? And in the case of adaptation, they don't generate cash flow. The majority of them, or at least are not perceived that way. They are long-term and therefore highly uncertain. They are relatively small with high transaction costs. And they are complex and there is scarce expertise. And they are untested. So you have all those set of answers of, maybe this investment in itself. But on the other hand, you also have the nature of the enabling environment. Whether these are the enabling environments provide poor information, weak institutions that are allowing to support the long-term investments, weak incentives, and not creating enough tax base, and lack of financing. All of these questions were posed, and Yali, you might find some of these common because were posed by the Global Commission on Adaptation, which WRI was a critical part of that. Carter Brandon was part of that as well. Carter and I have been talking a lot lately about cost of inaction, and then the Global Commission on Adaptation, they put on top of the table a set of answers and a call to action for that, to try to overcome these questions and these reasons why there is no more investment in adaptation, being that at a national level or being that at cities. And so the elements that they put on the table are, they say, there is not enough investment in adaptation because we haven't yet figured out how to internalize climate risks into our decision making. And that cuts across every single actor: multilaterals, governments, private sector. And without that, it's almost impossible to think of increased investments on adaptation because you're not seeing the value out of that. And hence, you're carrying a lot of costs down the road that somebody will need to pick up, being that the private sector disappearing or not being competitive anymore, or just the public sector going indebted and prioritizing things that, that otherwise they wouldn't be prioritizing. Like they would like to prioritize education and health, but they can't because they need to put all that money to try to recover infrastructure that was damaged by events. So what they say is the Global Commission on Adaptation says we need 3 revolutions. We need a revolution on understanding that help us how we analyze, learn about, and understand climate risks and solutions. We need a revolution on planning, on how we plan, make policy and investment decisions, and implement solutions. And then we need a revolution on finance, on how we finance required actions. And on finance, they say there is no silver bullet, but there are 4 actions that actually should be taken. And with that, I'll close to start pontificating here, but because I'm just repeating what the Global Commission on Adaptation said 5 years ago. Like, I'm not saying anything new, but it was put on the table and then it fizzled out. So just a good reminder of that. So the 4 things that they say on the revolution on finance are: first, there needs to be this building the climate risks and the climate cost into investment and financial decisions across the board. The second is the public sector plays a critical role to both provide and enable finance for adaptation actions. And it's not only by putting patient capital into actions that otherwise would not be invested by the private sector, but also it's about what I was saying before in terms of enabling environments. You need to create ways in which you can capture value out of public investments that could be attracting a private sector investment. You need to enhance your institution so you can have a reliable partner. Oh, that's perfect. You need to create the right incentives, maybe some subsidies or some elements that allow for private sector to come in. So you need to be a good partner on the side of the private sector. role for a private sector to be brought in, also for a private sector to actually take on initiative. And finally, to Angela's point, the multilateral development banks have a critical role to play on bridging finance, bridging investments, and bridging dialogue between actors that otherwise won't happen. And that investment on MDBs and DFIs in general to make those bridges. So I would say that, as a report says, there are, and you were saying that as well, Angela, there is a set of intergovernmental governance elements that are not allowing sometimes for cities to actually make some of those decisions by themselves because they require the central government to allow them, including tax incentives or value capture or other elements that will allow for a private sector to come in. Those are, hindered by some capacities or responsibilities and jurisdictional elements that might not be able to be at hand. So that just adds another layer in this conversation that makes things harder. So I'll stop there, but yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think we need a revolution, right? Like in so many fronts. And I think here today, what we want to talk is about data. So like this revolution on increasing data on climate risk, but also from our side, right? Understanding better the climate finance data, how much investments, where are they flowing? Where do we need more? Like where do we need to push? And then this is actually our, building on what you mentioned, Jorge, this is our last recommendation from the report, which is a continuous recommendation that we build this report also a lot with like climate policy initiative data from the global landscape of climate finance, adding on CDP's data, which was quite important to understand it better. And so, Katie, I'm gonna, let's say, finish my questions and then we're gonna open for your questions around how important is this data availability in the case of cities, and if you can tell us more, how can we use it? And I know that CDP is doing, and you mentioned a couple of examples to increase support for cities and financial institutions to share this data.
Yes, that's great. And definitely appreciated that being one of your key recommendations from this report. So again, all of this work that we're doing that we've highlighted in projects seeking financing is in partnership. So I think the first thing that I would call out is, the opportunity to leverage the data for different purposes. So we make our data available on our open data platform. Also, we also have a very strong partnership with the Global Covenant of Mayors, and for those purposes, using the data for advocacy of different sorts. I know that this has been really important for work that they've done within the context of development banks, and of course CPI as well, and looking at how to again analyze the data to really tell an important story around advocacy for something like the CHAMP initiative that we heard earlier. Another way that we're working, again, particularly on these projects seeking financing, is identifying where the gaps are so that we can create that virtuous cycle. So underpinning the work of, providing support of the projects to the PPF connector, so that the work that we heard from John Michael earlier, that, that can be synced up to be able to provide support. The GAP fund, through the disclosure, being able to identify about 80 projects that then made it through the GAP fund review process. And again, being able to use the data to tell that story around where projects are and where they need to go. Another way that we're tackling this is through endorsements of the actual request to cities to disclose. And so this is our second year in a row. We just announced it today that the European Investment Bank, this is the first, MDB that has endorsed the CDP-ICLEI track disclosure. This is the second year in a row. And again, that's not just about, the projects that are seeking financing. This is about that full picture of tracking disclosure and identifying climate risks. What we do depends on the country that we're in. Here in the US, a lot of the discussion right now is also around developing project pipeline for things like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So again, in country here in the US, we're working and linking up with different grant recipients to be able to identify how to provide that project pipeline. So again, looking at a specific country and how to amplify project pipeline to those specific entities. And two last things that I will just say is making sure that what data we are collecting continues to be dynamic. So something that we're going through this year in preparation for our 2025 questionnaire is a full consultation and review of these questions on projects seeking financing. So CDP overall is aligned with global standards and frameworks. There are a lot of acronyms, but making sure we're aligned with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure that became the ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board. The recommendations that came out of for cities, integrity matters. And again, making sure that our questionnaire is fit for purpose going forward. And last thing I will say, because of what I heard the mayor talk about, the rating agencies and the insurance industry. So we are seeing an uptick in interest in particular from these two entities in CDP data that is being tracked from local governments in particular. So, my call to action, of course, is the capacity building and support that we can provide for disclosure, but then again, ensuring that the data itself can be implemented and interrogated and used in these different ways. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, and I completely agree, Katie, on the need for dynamic data. I think like doing this report, working on it, we know that how can we make sure that we are looking for this space changes so much, even on technologies, and making sure that they're up to date. And this was a very good point. So I ask my questions. Let's open the floor for a couple of questions because I think we have minutes or comments. We would love to hear from you if you have any points. So if you can introduce yourself, and we have the mic because of the online. Yes.
All right. I'm Mark Weiss from Global Urban Development, and really add my voice to congratulating you on this really great and very important report. So I have a question for the lead author, I guess, for Jesse. But on one of the pieces of data you had was 29% of the mitigation finance for buildings. And I'm just wondering if you'd say more about what that includes, what types of investments and expenditures. Thanks.
Let's collect a couple and then we can lock. Does it work?
Yeah, thanks, Priscilla. Great panel. Just one observation, comment. I mean, as you know, I represent Jeff Global Environment Facility, where we support cities using a very systems-based approach, trying to deliver multiple benefits through our projects and through our partners. So does the report say anything on, how to deliver these different priorities in a more integrated manner? Like, we discussed about climate adaptation, mitigation, nature-based solutions, and various other things. So does the data say anything about that, how projects can actually deliver multiple things through one financing rather than, taking a siloed approach of adaptation financing, mitigation financing, or nature financing? So thank you.
And David, I will let you make the question, then we can answer and run for the panelists too.
Two really excellent reports and very interesting results. I'd like to speak on the question of adaptation because adaptation cannot be solved by projects. Adaptation requires constant, continual investment in the culverts, in the road maintenance, in the early warning systems, in the kind of things that were identified. It will never be a project by project approach. Now, there are some mechanisms out there. The local climate adaptive living facility is one, for example, that aims to provide a verifiable approach for streams of adaptation funding that are fungible at the local level, but go to measurable adaptation that solve these culvert early warning issues rather than project by project approach. So how can we move to that kind of way of addressing adaptation? How can we finance it by, again, continual flows rather than project by project approach? Because that's not going to solve the adaptation problem. Thank you.
No, very good, sir. Okay, Mike. No, go ahead.
Thank you. Great to learn about the report. Congratulations. Very quickly, I just wanted to touch on something that Jorge mentioned that I thought was really interesting, which is all the money spent each year on insurance and maybe cat bonds and things like that. And if you were to, maybe this could be an inquiry for next year for your report, for the next time you do your report. But if you could capture that, how much is being invested, perhaps the World Bank or another organization could monetize, leverage that for a financing instrument. I know UNCDF has looked at something like this. And anyway, I mean, it could be a lot of money. Okay.
Amazing. Very interesting point. So let's do it this way. So we have one question on buildings. Then we had a point on the integrated manner that I think connects very well with what David mentioned about this programmatic approach for adaptation, but more broadly. And I think some of our panelists also brought up this point. So I'll have Jesse answering on the buildings and what it entails. And then I would love to hear from you on the buildings and how do you see this programmatic approach on urban climate finance, on adaptation coming up at the urban level?
Great, thanks. So just very quickly on buildings and infrastructure, this includes primarily energy efficiency investments across both retrofits and new construction, as well as investments in energy efficient appliances and lighting and heat pumps. And again, not to be a broken record, but in the report, we do break down each sector in terms of what it entails and what the primary investments are going to. So in the report, there's a section on buildings and infrastructure. This section, we did our own capital expenditure estimations to estimate the incremental investments in buildings and appliances.
What percentage were retrofit?
I don't know offhand. I think it's 68 out of the total, but I don't know if that is. I can look it up.
We have all the detail and we have a methodology document that it's around 40 pages of a lot of details and fun that I invite you to also check it out. Oh, by the way, our design team have worked also and make this data accessible. So put a lot of effort on showing it in our website. We are sharing the data too. So that you organizations could use it and make fun with it with an Excel file for those that like it. So I would love to go to the panelists to answering these two questions, the programmatic approach that was mentioned a bit on the country level too, and particularly on adaptation. So who wants to go first? And the insurance then.
I can go a little bit. I agree. I totally agree. This has piecemeal approach, which is why I was mentioning about how ideally cities internalize this, and even from the typically funded transfers from national governments to local governments, they have to be climate informed and they have to have the adaptation from there, so that the flows are always dealing with this rather than being an add-on that comes later, right? I mean, it'll be even more difficult to measure, I'm sorry, if we do it that way, but I think it's the only way that it gets fully internalized and it gets fully included in every single dollar or whatever currency that is spent, rather than coming in with specific projects that, for us, from the perspective of multilaterals at least, is incredibly difficult to scale up, right? Like we spent 1 year preparing one single project that just deals with this little thing here. When will we address this? No, I think.
Thanks. Anyone else?
On the adaptation point, in terms of whether those are projects or not, I would generally agree with the gentleman that said that adaptation is a systemic issue. We need to look at it across the system and how we are building, reimagining our world, reimagining our investments, how the communities actually operate between them. But if we do that and we bring the public sector to operate in that space, in a new adaptation economy, something that could be looked differently to what we are used to. That could play a role. That could work for the public sector. but the private sector would still have the role of return on investment. And so, as much as you want to be systemic and holistic, you also need to figure out the way in which you're going to provide returns. And the returns are usually provided via specific, you have to provide boundaries to that, investable boundaries, being that a project, whatever you want to call it. But there's going to be a need to balance out the systemic vision with the specific investments. And those investments will require return for that. So, yeah, it's a tricky balance, to be honest, on it. And I would just gently push back that we also need projects in addition to a systemic approach to adaptation.
This is less an opinion, but then just to share what we saw from the data that was reported by local governments. So just on this point of, the 1,000 cities and states that reported in 2023, there were about 6,000 adaptation actions, right, from those local governments talking about what they wanted to do. And I just want to call out that about 500 of those local governments said, 500 of those local governments, they were funding 2,000 of them are funding those actions with their jurisdictional budgets. And so I think that's just one of these interesting questions around what is the role of adaptation finance coming in and how, who's paying for it. And this is something I would really be interested to look at the data a little bit more and then also track it going forward, what that looks like in Global North, Global South. But given that so much of the discussion today is on adaptation financing, I think this is a place where we can look at what are the projects seeking financing, but then also what are those actions and how they're funding them. Thank you.
Just on the issue of adaptation, you're right that if I do a project in my municipality, it's going to affect my downstream neighbor, and I might be affected by my upstream neighbor. So what makes much more sense is for us to have a regional approach, I think municipalities start to do that. They don't care whether it's called a project or not. What they care about, as you said earlier, is that the flooding stops and that they don't have to have the euphemistic conversations with constituents about strategic relocation, which basically means they have to leave their house because it shouldn't have been built where it was built because it's constantly subject to flooding. So I think that municipalities in that way, normally I wouldn't describe them as agile, but in that way, they actually are agile because they have to problem solve. And so they're kind of dealing with it in that sense. From a financier's point of view, when you aggregate all the municipalities together, it's a project for them. Whether the municipalities think of themselves as a project in that context or not is, I don't know, it's sort of neither here nor there. But I think we're in violent agreement with you, David.
With that, and we always like to finalize with agreement, I wanted to conclude by saying that a lot that was raised is also that a part of what we are calling now our 4Cs agenda. So, from what I heard, so we definitely need commitment. I think this paper, what we want to achieve with that is more commitment, showcase the data, and have the different players around the urban climate finance landscape committing to increase the finance. We need more collaboration. We see that we have all of the different sources of finance. We need these players to be working closer together. We need more and strengthen. I need to start with the C. We need capital markets strengthen, which is very important in making sure that in developing economies, we are able to create this space where the finance is ready to flow and we're speaking the same language, but we need capacity on the urban climate, like on the urban level, we need capacity for cities to be able to move this wheel. And with that, I want to thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss the state of cities. Thank you so much for all the institutions that have supported us to be able to put out this data. Please use it crazily. And that's our goal. And for that, thank you so much. And I'm very happy to call Barbara Buchner, who is our Global Managing Director from Climate Policy Initiative and our leader in CCFLA for the past 5 years, to the closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And it's great. I have some of you might have seen, I've missed a little bit of the discussions, but in my defense, I've been talking about CCFLA in every meeting I was between I left here and came back, and Caroline can testament that one. So there is a lot of interest in CCFLA, and again, I think you have had a great and a very long day, so I do thank you. Again, I thank also the ones who have been actually going to panels where I was as well, and then came back. Thank you. But I just wanted to take 2 minutes at the end of a very long day to kind of reflect, because again, this is 10 years of CCFLA, so I'm really excited what has been achieved. You have also heard from my team, and Priscilla is our fearless leader of CCFLA. So well, you've heard from her, and she's obsessed with like disease, as you probably also have heard. So we are talking about 4 Cs. You know, I'm like, okay, we've been like working very hard on those, but I do think, again, I am an optimist. I would not be in this room here and working on climate action since a very long time if I didn't believe that we still can make it different and can get this world on a better pathway. So I'm sure we can do it. Glasses half full. I do want to just end on some positive reflections, because it's been 10 years. And if you look backwards, I think we have made a lot of progress across the 4 Cs. I think on the commitment, for sure, if you, again, even like think back on when CCFLA was launched, there was not the commitment on the climate urban agenda that we have today. So I think there's progress. Capital mobilization, you've heard the latest data finally. I hope you all will be reading also the 40-page methodology document. That is very exciting. So you can be sharing that. But again, from the last numbers that we have, obviously we have better information as well, thanks to many of you. But at the same time, we have more than doubled the overarching number. So if you just think about like really like public finance, more than doubled, private finance, which is so important, more than tripled from the last figure. So that is progress for sure. Capacity building, I think there's progress. I think this is still something where we need to do more, but still at the same time, I think also through the CCFLA, that comes to the collaboration point that I wanted to say. I think just, you know, even for us, you know, it's 5 years that we have been lucky to take over the secretariat. It's just been amazing to see how the collaboration has improved and has strengthened between all of you, all of us. And I think that's just very heartening for me to see how the progress that we've made there. And I think we can do much more together. So this is a moment to celebrate as well. We all know we need to do more, but I think once in a while we can, you know, just like tap ourselves on the shoulders and say, look, we have made some progress, and let's be positive and let's build on that, and let's make sure that we can scale. Yeah, and of course we need to scale. We need to have more impact. But I think looking backwards, we have achieved a lot. Now it's time to accelerate and work together. And by working together, I truly believe we can make more happen. And so with that, I think I'm just going to not add all the other things I wanted to say. I just want to say one thing. We need a systemic approach, yes, and credit agencies clearly are watching, because like all the mics stopped working. So I think someone is like listening here. So be careful now. I think we need the final point probably on collaboration. I think we've made good progress in getting lots of actors into the room that were not there 10 years ago. I think we still need to do more. We need more of the, you know, we need the credit agencies in the room. We need institutional investors in the room. We need to make sure that we really understand how can we work better together, and how can we localize the action and really be demand and needs driven from the ground, from the bottom up in the countries. And I very much look forward to continuing to working with all of you on this agenda. Again, I do thank you all very much for your time, for your expertise. A big thank you to my team.